Portugal's parliament has approved a new law that blocks children under 13 from using social media at all and requires express verified parental consent for teens up to 16 to have accounts on platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Joining us now is Andrew Selepak, a social media professor at the University of Florida, who studies how online platforms shape our culture and communication. Good to have you with us, Andrew. First, help us understand what Portugal has actually done, how significant the move is, and how it compares to other countries around the world, including the US.
Well, one of the things that essentially what Portugal's looking to do is try to prevent young people under the age of 16 from being able to just kind of go onto social media and use the platforms however, whenever they want, with some limitations, WhatsApp being one of them. This is kind of standard that we're seeing in Europe. Australia has done something similar as well, where you have these countries that kind of recognize that there's a danger for young people being on social media, being exposed to different content. While they're still in their formative years, they don't necessarily have the media literacy skills, the understanding, and can be very impressionable. So they're looking for a solution to a problem, whether or not it's a viable solution, a practical solution, or even a good solution, is sort of where we're at the moment.
And in concrete terms, how close or far is a country like the US from doing something similar?
Well, keep in mind, when we're talking about right now is European countries, Australia, we're talking about places that don't have their own social media. You've even had some European government leaders basically saying they're concerned about American and Chinese social media. Here in the US, overwhelmingly people here are using companies we're familiar with, Meta, YouTube, things like that. Other places around the world, they are using some of the Chinese social media platforms, but Europe doesn't have any. We don't associate any social media platforms with Germany, the UK, France. They really haven't contributed to that space in quite some time, outside of some peripheral things like Telegram, or if you want to count Spotify. So for them, they're basically looking at this as a way to regulate something that they don't really have a close association with. And I think a lot of it is not necessarily because they're trying to protect children. There's a lot of ways that they're not protecting children in many of these European countries. But if you look in the sort of the details, a lot of it is if the companies don't sort of comply with their laws, they have huge fines that they're going to put into place to these very, very wealthy trillion-dollar companies. So I think part of it is, looking to find a way to protect children. I don't think this is necessarily going to be the best way. I more lean on the side of education, but I think a big part of it is also, again, that they don't have European social media platforms. They don't have that sort of connection to it. And instead, they're looking at it as a way to kind of levy fines.
Yeah, so let's talk about potential other solutions that could be implemented here in the USA. You've talked about education. What would that look like in terms of what is really effective? And what can parents do who may want to help their children out before Congress potentially takes more further action?
So kind of a big question. If we kind of look at it in maybe two different parts, the first part would be with parents. I think the big thing for parents, regardless of, how young your child is, 1, 2, 3 years old, 13, 18 years old. One of the big things for them is just to understand the platforms. Mostly if we think about maybe Gen Z, younger millennial parents, they have a pretty good idea of what these platforms are doing, the influence that they can have. But maybe older millennial parents, Gen X parents, they don't necessarily understand the platforms, the new platforms, how people are consuming content, the amount of content being consumed on there. So for them, one of the first things is just kind of learning about it and being comfortable. It's also important for them to recognize the impact that it has. A lot of people don't necessarily recognize that Gen Z, Gen Alpha, we're kind of putting them in a petri dish and sort of testing how so much content will impact young minds, how will impact that moving forward. And, it's a bit concerning that we don't it's basically like testing a drug and we don't know what the side effects are going to be until it's too late. The flip side, if you want to talk about what, essentially governments here or the US government can do, with that, I don't know necessarily if much is going to happen, only because we know that these companies are spending a lot of money on lobbying and preventing any legislation or regulation from being passed.
And in terms of education, if we can separate that out potentially from congressional action, what would some effective education tools look like to you?
Well, I mean, I think that would go into a kind of conversation about sort of K through 12 education as a whole and how much it's actually really teaching young people the life skills that they need. But one of them would just be sort of the media literacy aspect, understanding that media content has an impact on the audience, what those impacts are, the differences between individuals, that, simply watching a piece of content does not impact everyone the same across the board, but it's really dependent on individuals. And it's kind of recognizing the individuality of people and how consuming media content, especially for young people, can have very different but also very long-term and lasting effects. So some of it is for probably educators to also become educated on these topics and these issues, and then implementing them into K through 12 education. That's always generally a fight in and of itself. Where would it fit? Obviously not in a math class or a social studies class. Does it fit into an English class? Do we suddenly start adding new technology classes? That's really, I think, where we have the devil in the details, but it's very necessary, I think, for young people to gain these types of skills, abilities, and knowledge, as well as the people teaching the classes who can then teach these skills, abilities, and knowledge.
An ongoing experiment, as you say. Thank you so much, Andrew Selepak. Great to have your insights today.
Thank you.